Hi there, this is DML, and this is another edition of Sotdl Talk. And today I'm going to keep it a little bit short because my last video was about 2 hours long, and I really don't want them to be that long. I want them to be consumable and shorter amounts of time. So this one's going to be considerably shorter. Today's topic is going to be Shadow the Demon Lord versus Dungeons and Dragons. But before I get into that, I would like to make a correction from my last video. And if you'll recall, my last video was about combat. And it was a combat encounter that I had thrown together that involved 3 PCs and a creature known as a Muttering Maw. And during the course of that combat, I had given some incorrect information that I want to rectify right now. And so I'm going to try to recreate the screen as much as possible by getting the characters and the creature out here. And I believe I had a Goblin Rogue. I had a Clockwork Warrior. I think he was over here. And I had a Human Magician who was right there. And if I remember correctly, I believe the Muttering Maw had come up on the Human Magician like so. All right, so the the combat encounter had it started with the Clockwork going in here and fighting, and the Muttering Maw moving up after the magician had cast a spell. So it was the goblin's turn, and the goblin was going to sneak past or sneak in between the magician's legs without being noticed by the Muttering Maw, who doesn't have eyes, and try to make a sneak attack on the Muttering Maw. Now, what I said in that video was I would make it an opposed attack. Well, or an opposed roll, meaning that the goblin would make an agility roll and the Muttering Maw would make a perception roll. And that's not how it works in Shadow the Demon Lord. So that, forget I said that. I tend to mix games together sometimes, especially when I'm playing them simultaneously. Well, not simultaneously, but I'm playing with I'm playing in a D&D game, and I'm also playing in a Shadow the Demon Lord game. So sometimes the streams cross, and I get some rules confused. So apologize for that. There are no opposed roles like that in Shadow the Demon Lord. The closest thing to it is an attack against an attribute, which wouldn't have been appropriate in this scenario. What would have been appropriate would have been for the goblin to just try to sneak across by making an agility challenge roll. And I could have imposed a bane or two based on the Muttering Maw's ability to perceive things. That would have been totally legit, but otherwise it would have just been an agility challenge roll. If he makes it, then he sneaks past the magician, and I would have allowed the sneak attack to progress at that point. So that's how it should be handled. And since the combat session was kind of improvised, I mean, I kind of planned the layout, but I didn't choreograph it. So I just kind of went with the flow. And sometimes when you're jamming and you don't know a precise rule, then you have to make a ruling that makes sense. And even though the opposed roll is not something that is in Shadow the Demon Lord, it could work. But at that point, you're introducing a new mechanic that may not fit or may actually conflict with existing mechanics. So just wanted to get that clarified. Just wanted to make sure that I wasn't confusing anybody with my last video, and understand what the actual action should have been for that Goblin Rogue. Okay, now that I'm done with that, let me go ahead and just chit-chat a little bit about Shadow the Demon Lord versus Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the reason I am picking this topic is because I'm playing both. I'm playing both. I'm running a Dungeons and Dragons game, and I'm playing in a Shadow of the Demon Lord game. And I enjoy both games immensely. I love D&D. I've played it since 8th grade, I think, ninth grade, well in excess of 30 years. And, it's part of my DNA. So for me to say that, any game is better than D&D is really kind of disingenuous. But as I've played more and more Shadow of the Demon Lord, I can appreciate the freshness that game brings to the fantasy genre, even though it's technically fantasy horror. Um, and even though D&D just had a new edition launched, well, not just, but it's been 4 years, but still 4 or 5 years, and it's pretty well. It's the newest edition of D&D, so you would think that there would be some freshness to that as well. And there were some new concepts that were brought into the game, but for the most part, the D&D game that exists today is very similar to the D&D game that existed 30 years ago. Um, and clearly there are some major differences as well, but the core concepts in the game are still very similar. And whereas that may give people who enjoy the game a sense of, familiarity, um, the problem for me is that it can tend to get boring really quick. I can get bored of D&D pretty quickly. And the reason for that is because, how many times can you cast Magic Missile? How many times can you fight the same monsters over and over again? And sure, some can argue that, the same things are in Shadow of the Demon Lord. You have a version of Magic Missile in Shadow of the Demon Lord. You have many of the same monsters that are in D&D in Shadow of the Demon Lord. But it's the differences in Shadow of the Demon Lord versus D&D that, for me, put a fresh coat of paint on the fantasy genre. So let me just explain what I mean by this. And I'm going to start with the with the ancestries, because ancestries is the first chapter in the Shadow of the Demon Lord book, and I think it's the one of the first chapters in the D&D book as well. So in the D&D book, your races that you start off with are your typical races. You got your humans, you have your dwarves, you have your elves, you have your half elves, you have your halflings, you have your half orcs, and then they threw in a couple of kind of newish races by including the Dragonborn, which was more of a fourth edition thing, and the Tiefling, which was also more of a fourth edition thing. And of course, they had sub races. So the elves had Drow as a sub race, and Drow have always, not always, but have been included in D&D to some extent as a player character race. So that's not entirely new. But that's it. Those are your basic races in the player's handbook. And of course, there have been subsequent releases that allow you to play monstrous races and such. But when you think of Dungeons and Dragons, you think of those races, and those are certainly there in the player's handbook. In the Shadow of the Demon Lord, you have your starting ancestries, as of course you have your human and then you have your dwarf. But at that point, it starts to digress into some pretty odd choices for ancestries. You have your changeling, which is essentially a shapeshifter that has fey origins, but for the most part, they are all intents and purposes they're fey, but they are shapeshifters, so they can emulate any race, any humanoid race. And then you have the goblin as a player character. I think goblins have been a fan favorite for a while. I think Pathfinder made them pretty popular. So including them as a player character race right off the bat in the core rulebook is pretty cool. Um, and the background they give them um, is also pretty cool because they were a Fey race. They were basically booted out. Um, and there are also some qualities of the Goblin race that make them kind of endearing. But beyond that, you have the Clockwork, which is an ancestry that is essentially a construct. So it would be akin to having a Warforged in D&D. But a Clockwork Warrior is actually um, a living soul that is trapped within um, a clockwork body. There's that bit of difference between a clockwork and a warforged. So that's pretty cool. That's definitely ripe for role playing opportunities. And then finally, you have your orcs. And orcs in Shadow of the Demon Lord have a very unique origin, which also is very ripe for role playing opportunities. And how orcs fit into the society um, of the world that Shadow of the Demon Lord is baked into. Um, it's a cool race with a cool background and lots of cool potential. So right off the bat, just with the ancestries versus the races in D&D, you get some freshness that just wasn't there with the relaunch of 5th edition D&D. So now let's talk about classes. So the D&D classes are pretty much the same, and you've got your fighters, you've got your clerics, you have your druids, you have your wizards, you have your sorcerer, you have your warlock, you got your ranger, you got a barbarian, you got a cleric. So it's all the same race or classes that you've known for. Most of them go back to first edition D&D. So, oh, and I forgot the monk. And so all of those races in the player's handbook, they're fine. I mean, they're all enjoyable, but again, they're so done, overdone. And so comparing that to what you have in the Shadow of the Demon Lord and just the leveling up and the progression of your character's career is so starkly different than Dungeons and Dragons. So first of all, you start off as a starting character, 0 level. You don't have any type of class. You're basically a normal person, and you're put into an abnormal situation that puts you on the path to adventure from that day forward. So you start off your campaign with a 0 level adventure. From that point, you go to the novice tier, which is first and second level. That's where you pick your novice path, and your novice path consists of 4 basic archetypes. You've got your warrior, which is akin to the fighter. You have your priest, which is like the cleric. You have your magician, which is like the wizard, and then you have your rogue, which is like the rogue in D&D. So, there's nothing too innovative about that, but it's where those 4 basic classes go from there that makes the game so much different than Dungeons and Dragons. So you go from your novice tier to your expert tier, and your expert tier starts at 3rd level, and it goes 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. And when you choose your expert path, you have a significantly larger number of choices at that point. So you're basically fine-tuning your character into a character concept in a progression. So you could take your rogue character, and then when you get your expert path, you could make him pretty much anything. You can make him a rogue wizard. You can make him a rogue fighter. You can make him a rogue cleric. You can make him a rogue sharpshooter. You can make him a rogue warlock. I mean, it's the possibilities are significant, and that goes the same with all the other novice classes. You could do wizard rogue. You could do wizard sharpshooter. There's just lots of possibilities there. And then it gets even better when you get to the master tier. The master tier starts at 7th level. It goes 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th. And the game caps out at 10th level, which is another thing I enjoy over D&D. And so when you get to 7th level, you pick your master path. And your master path is even more fine-tuned than your expert path. So that's where you start getting into, let's say if you're a wizard or an arcanist, you start getting into specialty magic. Or if you're a warrior fighter type, then you start fine tuning the type of warrior and fighter that you want to evolve into. Maybe you're a weapons master, or maybe you're a berserker or something along those lines. And you have a huge number of options for your master path. All told, I think the various combinations put together adds up to several thousand different combo possibilities. So the chances that you're going to get bored with the type of characters you're going to be playing in Shadow the Demon Lord versus the type of characters that you have available to you in D&D is much less. So that's another reason why I choose Shadow the Demon Lord over D&D. It's just many more options available to you in building a character. The other thing, a couple other things that I find better than D&D, and I mentioned a moment ago, and one is the 10 level cap on the game. So one of my biggest gripes with Dungeons and Dragons has always been how long it takes to progress a character from first level to the top level of the game, which has changed over the years, but it has typically been anywhere between 15th level to 30th level. I forget what it was in first edition D&D, but I think it was either 15th or 20th level, something like that. And I know in third edition it went to 20th level, but then it had the epic level. The epic level book that came out that you could progress past 20th level, and then fourth edition was built right from the start to go from first to 30th level. So the amount of time it takes you to get from first to 30th level or whatever the cap is, it just takes forever. And the reason for that is because the game was originally built around the concept of experience points, which means you have to fight things, or you have to find things to get experience points. You have to have so many experience points in order to level up. And gaining experience points takes time. Many GMs enjoy spreading that over a long period of time because they like to have games that are last years. But the reality for me is that a game that's going to last years is just not realistic. I am a middle-aged man, and I've got middle-aged man responsibilities, which means that my free time is extremely limited, and the free time of my gaming group is extremely limited. We're lucky to get together as often as we do. And thanks to the advent of Roll20 and the virtual tabletop, we can game much more frequently over the internet than we ever could face to face. We're lucky to get together once a month. It's more on average of once every 3 months that we are able to physically get into the same room to play a game. And even then, we spend probably the first hour or two just shooting shit, and before we even start playing. So playing online has allowed me to really focus my game and get a good 3-hour session, much more done in a 3-hour session than I could in any 3 hours at a physical table. So even saying that, though, it's still unrealistic for me to expect my players to be available for years to play through a campaign. And quite frankly, my ability to run a game for years is pretty limited because I get bored rather easily, And there are a ton of other RPGs and a ton of other adventures that I want to run. So locking myself into a 2 year D&D game and that's all I play, I don't even want to do that. And I don't think my players want to do that either. We want to have some variety in our gaming, but at the same time, we want a sense of accomplishment and we want to, play through a game that's meaningful. So Shadow of the Demon Lord came out about 3 or 4 years ago, and one of the selling points for me was that you could play a full campaign in 11 sessions. And of course, I was assuming that a session is a certain amount of certain length, and so um, there was that assumption. But for the most part, it came through on its promise. It delivered. The way that the game is set up, you can actually play through 11 sessions, each session uh, its own game, its own adventure, I should say, and you could complete an entire story arc in basically 2.5 months, almost 3 months. So to me, that was extremely appealing because, quite frankly, I don't know how many times I've started a D&D campaign only to have it fizzle out before I got anywhere near the conclusion of the game. So, another reason why I enjoyed Shadow of the Demon Lord over D&D these days is just because I can actually complete a campaign. And that gives me and the players a sense of accomplishment. Now, truth be told, the games are not as in depth as a 2 year D&D game would be, and it's that's just to be expected. You can't squeeze 2 years worth of gaming into 11 sessions. Uh, so some things are skipped over, some things are not delved into very much. Character backgrounds don't come into play as much as probably they do in D&D. But they still can come into play. They still can and do make a difference in the play experience. So it's not like you sacrifice them completely, but what you are compromising is the depth that you would get into otherwise in a D&D game versus a Shadow of the Demon Lord game. So those are my main beefs with D&D. Now, again, just to reiterate, I'm not D&D bashing. I love D&D. I always will love D&D. But right now, today, I would rather play or I'd rather run Shadow of the Demon Lord than I would Dungeons and Dragons, simply for the reasons that I just outlined. There are other reasons, which I'm not going to get into today because I wanted to keep this video fairly short. But I really wanted to do this video just in case anybody out there was feeling similar to how I am about Dungeons and Dragons and how everything just feels kind of tired. And so my recommendation to you then is to look at some options, and I would say look at Shadow of the Demon Lord first and give it a shot. It's super cheap. You can go out and drive-through RPG. They just had a sale for the PDF for $8. I don't know if it's still on, but those sales come around periodically. So you can pick up the PDF very cheap. You can also pick up a ton of supplements for Shadow of the Demon Lord at an extremely reasonable price. Another selling point for Shadow of the Demon Lord, and I don't work for this company, incidentally. I just love the game and I love the marketing behind it. A great thing about the supplements and adventures for this game is that they're short. You could buy an adventure. Each adventure is a minimum of 3 or 4 pages, no more than 6 or 7 pages or 8 pages. I think is probably the longest adventure. And you're going to pay $2 or $3 max for an adventure that you can consume in one evening, versus spending $50 for a campaign book for Dungeons and Dragons that you're probably never going to finish because it's going to take you a year and a half to get through the damn thing. And then the price point of $50 for the book is also prohibitive to a lot of people. I mean, $50 is a lot of money to drop on on an adventure that you're not too sure that you're ever going to finish. So that is another selling point for Shadow the Demon Lord. And the supplements are awesome. They truly supplement the game. They add different options. They add lots of flavor and background to the game world. So again, I just highly recommend Shadow the Demon Lord. If you're not interested in that simply because of the horror aspect of Shadow the Demon Lord, then there's another game called 13th Age, which is a kind of a uh, combination of maybe an earlier version of D&D and fourth edition D&D. There's a lot drawn from early editions and a lot drawn from fourth edition to create something a little unique. 13th Age has a lot of cool stuff about it. The thing, however, about 13th Age is I've never actually played it. I got the book in the Kickstarter, so I was one of the backers for the original 13th Age Kickstarter, but I have yet to actually run or play a 13th Age game, which is, um, you know, I would love to actually play in a game, first of all, and then I would love to run a game. But, my players have been, for the most part, satisfied with D&D and Shadow of the Demon Lord, so I really haven't had a need to try out 13th Age, but I definitely would if we ever got to the point where my players were no longer interested in or wanted a break from both of the aforementioned games. So, there are options out there, is basically what I'm saying. So give them a shot. It doesn't mean that you can't ever come back to D&D. You can always come back to D&D. D&D is like the number one game by far for fantasy role playing. So it's always going to be there in one incarnation or another. So, do yourself a favor and take a break, take a vacation from D&D for a little while, try some different things out. If for no other reason, to recharge your D&D battery, so when you come back to the good old reliable, um, you can do so with some fresh eyes. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to cover in this session. So thank you all again for watching, and I will catch you on my next video. I don't know what the topic's going to be yet, but we'll figure it out between now and then. Until then, hail. How to turn this damn thing off? Hail.